The ceasefire happened. Iran stood down. Everyone exhaled. That is the part nobody is explaining, because the Strait of Hormuz was never the real problem. It was just the thing that exposed the real problem. And the real problem has been quietly draining your wallet, killing your job prospects, and making everything you buy more expensive, long before Iran fired a single missile. This video is about that. When oil hit $150 a barrel, a price the US had not seen since the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve learned something it could not unlearn. Inflation can detonate from places monetary policy cannot reach. A war, a choke point, a missile. That is when they got trapped. Here is what everyone expects to happen now that oil is falling. Prices drop, inflation cools, the Fed cuts rates, hiring comes back. Clean, logical, simple. None of that is happening. The Fed cannot relax just because oil fell. One geopolitical flare-up away from $150 again means they have to keep rates high. Not because inflation is still raging, but because they cannot afford to be caught cutting when the next shock hits. And here is who built that trap. The same administration that wants the Fed to cut rates is also running the tariff policy, the trade war, and the deficit spending that makes cutting rates dangerous in the first place. Trump is not just pressuring Powell to ease up, he is making it structurally impossible for Powell to do it safely. That is the contradiction, and it is about to get worse. Trump has two flagship job creation policies: tariffs, to bring manufacturing back to America; deportations, to open up jobs for American citizens. Same stated goal, two completely separate mechanisms. And both of them push inflation in different directions at the same time. Tariffs are a direct tax on imports, 25% on Mexico, 10% on most of the world. Every part, every material, every component that crosses a border now costs more. Manufacturers do not absorb that. They pass it to you. And for anyone refinancing a mortgage right now, that price pass-through is not abstract. It is showing up in your monthly payment. Jerome Powell said it explicitly in December 2024. Tariffs are the primary inflation driver right now. Not energy, not supply chains, policy. That is a problem the Fed cannot ignore because tariff-driven inflation is not temporary. It is structural. It does not resolve itself. Which means the Fed's only response, raising interest rates, is not optional. It is forced. And higher rates mean your credit card, your car loan, your mortgage all get more expensive. The cure is painful. That's trapdoor 1. Trapdoor 2 is about to make it worse. That's where the second policy kicks in. Deportations shrink the labor pool. Fewer workers means businesses compete harder to hire. Competition for workers drives wages up. And when wages rise, businesses raise prices to cover payroll. That's inflation from the supply side. So now you have it. Tariffs pushing prices up from the demand side. Deportations pushing prices up from the supply side. Both at once. Both structural. Neither temporary. The Fed sees both and has one response: keep rates high. Higher. For longer. And high rates kill hiring. Full stop. The policies designed to create jobs force the Fed to destroy them. They didn't stumble into this, they built it. This contradiction was always buried in the policy design. The Iran crisis didn't create it. It just ripped the cover off, and now there's no putting it back. Even with oil falling, the Fed can't move. External shocks like a war, a choke point, or a missile can spike inflation overnight. Cutting rates now means getting caught flat-footed when the next one hits. So they hold, defensive, locked. Here is what that actually does to the job market. When borrowing gets expensive, companies do not fire people immediately. They do something quieter, they freeze. A manufacturer shelves the new plant. A restaurant chain cancels the new location. Your employer stops posting the role they were going to hire for. The jobs do not disappear from payrolls. They disappear from LinkedIn, and the data is already showing it. In April 2025, the hiring rate hit its lowest point since 2008, outside of pandemic lockdowns. Construction hiring was down 8% month over month. Tech and finance are pulling back. Logistics and transportation, which should be expanding right now, are frozen because the financing cost on new equipment is impossible. Then the second layer hits small businesses. A mom-and-pop operation that borrowed at 3% 5 years ago is now refinancing at 6 to 7%. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a 50% increase in monthly payments on a business that was already running thin margins. They have two options: cut staff or close. Most are cutting. This is what a structural trap looks like from the inside. The Fed is not doing this out of spite. They are doing it because the policy environment gives them no other move. And until that changes, specifically the tariffs, the labor shock, and the geopolitical overhang, none of this resolves. Here's what most people don't understand about the Federal Reserve. Their most powerful tool isn't interest rates. It's credibility. If people believe the Fed controls inflation, they behave accordingly. They don't rush to buy before prices rise. They don't accelerate every purchase decision. They wait. That patience is what keeps inflation from feeding itself. But the moment people stop believing the Fed is in control, the moment they think prices are going up regardless, behavior changes. Everyone tries to lock in prices before they rise further. That panic spending creates the very inflation they feared. Demand spikes not because of fundamentals, but because of the fear. So the Fed's entire job right now isn't just fighting inflation. It is performing control, signaling constantly that we are prepared. We will not blink, and that performance has a price. Rates stay high, not temporarily but structurally, because the moment Powell signals relief, expectations shift. People assume inflation is solved. They start spending ahead of it. And if another shock hits while rates are falling, the Fed loses the one thing it cannot recover, the belief that it is in charge. So Powell holds. Oil falls. The war ends. The crisis passes, and the rates don't move. Hiring stays frozen. Not because of recession, because the Fed is trapped inside an unpredictable future that Trump's policies built, and there is no clean exit. You might think, okay, this is bad, but it's temporary. Eventually, inflation comes down. Eventually, the Fed cuts rates. Eventually, hiring recovers. That's the logical sequence. That's what should happen. But here is what changes everything. The Fed's credibility is an asset. It is not infinite. It can be spent, and they have already been spending it. In 2021, Powell called inflation transitory. It was not. That cost him. Every month rates stayed high while inflation still did not cooperate, and that cost him more. Credibility does not reset. It accumulates damage. So now Powell cannot afford to signal relief prematurely. The moment he does, expectations shift, behavior changes, and if another shock hits while rates are falling, the anchor breaks entirely. And a Fed that has lost the inflation anchor is not just ineffective, it is dangerous. So the trap does not break when oil falls. It does not break when the war ends. It does not break when the headlines move on. It only breaks when one of three things happens. Tariffs come down, which requires a policy reversal the current administration has shown no appetite for. Inflation falls into deflation, which requires a recession. The Fed cuts rates anyway, gambling that no new shock is coming, which could spiral into the exact crisis they have been defending against. None of those happen in the next 6 months. The math does not allow it. This is not temporary pain. This is the system now, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is what nobody is telling you about who actually wins in this system. When rates stay high and inflation stays elevated, asset prices climb. Your house appreciates, your stock portfolio recovers, real estate values rise. High rates limit new housing supply, and that protects the value of what already exists. If you bought a house 5 years ago at $400,000 and it's now worth $550,000, you didn't do anything. You just held it. That's free wealth, generated by the same system that's freezing everyone else out. But if you're looking for a job right now, you're on the other side of that equation. Fewer postings, more competition, companies frozen, salaries stagnating. You're competing for positions that don't exist because the borrowing costs that protect your landlord's asset value are the same costs preventing your employer from hiring. Same system, opposite outcomes. It depends entirely on which side of the asset line you're standing on. That's what a K-shaped economy actually means. Not rich versus poor. That's too simple. Asset owners versus wage earners. One group rides the system up, the other gets pressed down by the same forces lifting everyone above them. And every month the Fed holds rates high, the K gets wider. The winners accumulate, the losers run out of options, and the gap between them stops being a gap and starts being a wall. This trap has a historical signature. You've seen it before. 1973, OPEC embargo, oil shock. Inflation exploded. The Fed raised rates to fight it, but the economy was already weak, and high rates on top of an inflation shock created something new. Stagflation. Stagnant growth and rising prices at the same time. The unemployment numbers tell the story. In 1973, it sat just under 5%. 2 years later, it had nearly doubled. By 1982, it crossed 10%. The highest since the Great Depression. That's what happens when the system locks in. But here's the critical difference between 1973 and now, and this is the part that should concern you. In 1973, the trap was temporary. The oil shock was external and unpredictable, but it passed. OPEC's leverage had limits. The embargo ended, inflation came down, the Fed had an off-ramp. In 2025, there is no off-ramp. Tariffs are not a shock. They are policy. They do not resolve on their own. They are baked into the system until someone decides to unbake them. That means inflationary pressure does not pass. It stays, and the Fed stays defensive against it indefinitely. In 1973, the Fed was trapped temporarily. In 2025, the Fed is trapped structurally. That is not a small distinction. That is the difference between a recession and a decade. Same mechanism, different decade, same trap, and it is tightening right now. 4 metrics tell you what the system is actually doing, not what politicians promise, not what headlines say, what's real. First, oil futures. If oil stays in the 80s and drifts lower, markets think inflation is containable and the Fed has room. If it breaks above 100, markets are pricing in the next shock, and the Fed locks in tighter. Oil is the canary in the coal mine. Second Fed tone. When Powell speaks, listen for how he frames inflation, whether he describes it as a problem being solved or a risk still being managed. Patience and vigilance mean rates stay high. Optimism about the inflation trajectory means a pathway to cuts is opening. The tone shifts before the policy does. Third, job posting volume. Go to LinkedIn, Indeed, or Glassdoor in your industry. Count the open roles today. Check again in 2 weeks. If the number is falling, companies are already pausing, and this shows up 3 to 4 weeks before layoffs get announced. Job postings are your early warning system. Fourth, consumer confidence. When people believe inflation is permanent, they pull back spending. Less spending means less demand. Less demand means less hiring. This is where Fed tightening starts to cascade psychologically. The moment the system shifts from "we are managing" to "this is going to be bad." Watch confidence. These 4 metrics show you where the system is actually heading. Your job prospects, your raise, your ability to stay employed, all of it moves with these numbers before anyone in Washington admits what's happening. Let me be direct about what you are actually looking at. Trump's policies were not sabotaged from the outside. They were not undermined by Iran or the Fed or bad luck. They contradicted each other from the inside. Tariffs and deportations both push inflation. Inflation forces the Fed to raise rates. High rates destroy the job market. The policies designed to create jobs mechanically guaranteed the Fed would freeze them. This is not a failure of execution. This is a structural flaw. Built in, inevitable, and the system it creates has winners. Asset owners, people with houses, stocks, real estate, get richer in exactly the conditions that freeze everyone else out. The K-shaped economy does not happen by accident. It gets built, policy by policy, rate decision by rate decision, until the gap stops being a gap and becomes a wall. You saw the ceasefire and thought the crisis was over. You thought oil would fall, inflation would cool, rates would drop, and hiring would come back. But the Iran crisis was never the disease. It was the diagnostic. It showed you what was already broken before the first missile flew. The contradiction is not in the Strait of Hormuz. It is at the center of the policy design itself. And it is still there, unchanged, tightening. The question was never whether this gets better. The question is how bad it gets before something breaks.